वीडियोस में हमने सीखा था कि लिवर्स क्या है, सेंटर ऑफ ग्रेविटी क्या है, लाइन ऑफ ग्रेविटी क्या है, एंड हाउ टू अप्लाई, राइट? So in today's lecture we will be talking about axis and planes. So axis and planes क्यों use करते हैं? First of all, axis and planes are used to define the movement. Okay, हमारे बॉडी में कौन सी मूवमेंट हो रही है इसको डिफाइन करने के लिए we use axis and planes, okay, as a reference point. Okay, so let us first understand what is a plane. Okay, so considering that this is a sheet of paper, तो इस शीट ऑफ पेपर को हम कंसिडर करेंगे एक प्लेन. ओके, वॉट एवर यू ड्रॉ, अगर समझो आपने एक सर्कल ड्रॉ किया इसके अंदर, सो दिस सर्कल लाइज इन द प्लेन. ओके, उस पेज के ऊपर अगर आप कोई सर्कल ड्रॉ कर रहे हैं तो हम क्या कहेंगे कि द सर्कल इज लाइंग इन द प्लेन. ओके, तो दिस इज अ प्लेन. ओके, दैट इज द एरिया जिसके अंदर कोई भी चीज हो रही है. ओके, तो दिस सर्कल इज प्लेस्ड इन द plane. Okay, now with respect to movement, so all of us have seen a hanging bar, right? So in this hanging bar, this thing over here, okay, the person is holding at this place. Okay, now consider that if the person is moving around the axis, okay, it's spinning around the axis in this way and coming back to its first position, then bar is the this bar is the axis of the motion. Okay, this is the axis of the motion. Similarly, if we talk about a top, okay, when we talk about a top that is spinning, its axis passing straight through its center. Okay, and the motion of the top is rotating around this axis, okay, in this way, right? So this is the axis of this toy. This is the axis of the person that is rotating around this bar. And what is the plane of the motion? So for this uh, top, the plane of the motion will be perpendicular to the axis. Okay, so if the axis is like this, the plane will be exactly horizontal for us to see, and the top will be rotating through the plane. Okay, or we can say if this is the floor. Okay, so the movement is taking place in this plane around this axis. Okay, now we have also seen the graph paper, right? We have made graphs, so in that we do have an axis. Okay, there are two axes that we use in a graph paper, right? Since the graph paper is a two-dimensional sheet, we use it for two. Okay, so this is an x-axis here. This is the y-axis. Okay, now considering since our body is a three-dimensional object, there is also another axis, that is a z-axis. Okay, and z-axis is used when we talk about a three-dimensional object, right? So now this system of three axis is used for plotting graphs to define an object in space, right? We used to do in math. Similarly, in our body, to define movement, we use such an axis so we can define the movement. Now in our body, what and how we use them, so let us now understand the use of planes and axes to define a movement in a little more detail. Define an object, right? So considering the human body, there are three different axes and that are used to understand the motion of the body, okay, or a position of the body as well. So let us consider these axes. So this one here is the sagittal axis. Okay, it lies in the sagittal plane. Okay, so you see the orientation of the sagittal plane. This sagittal axis lies in this plane. Okay, We'll talk about the frontal axis. So this here is the frontal axis, and this lies in this frontal plane. Okay, so the frontal axis lies in the frontal plane, sagittal axis lies in the sagittal plane. And now talking about the last axis, and that is the longitudinal axis. Okay, so this here up is the longitudinal axis, which is similar to the y-axis in the graph that we use. Okay, so it is straight down from the head to down. Okay, so this axis is the longitudinal axis. Now, considering the association of the three axes that we've talked about with the three planes that are present in the human body. The first is the frontal plane, second is the sagittal plane, and the third is the transverse plane. Okay. Planes divide our body into two parts. If we talk about the frontal plane, it divides our body into front and the back. If we talk about the sagittal plane, it divides our body into left and right. And if we talk about the transverse plane, it divides our body into upper half and the lower half. Okay, and the plane is positioned according to the joint. Okay, so if we are talking about the shoulder joint, it should pass through the shoulder joint. If we are talking about the neck, it should pass through the neck. Okay, if we are talking about the sagittal plane, for shoulder joint, the plane will be passing through the shoulder joint. Okay, sagittal axis. Okay, the sagittal axis is here. I'll use another color. So the sagittal axis is here and it is perpendicular to the frontal plane. Okay, it is exactly perpendicular. So whenever a movement is taking place around this axis, okay, in this axis, the movement is taking place in this plane. Okay, so the plane is here, and the movement is taking in this plane. Like we draw a circle on the sheet of paper, the movement is taking place in the plane, that is the frontal plane. Okay, so you need to you need to keep in mind that the frontal plane and the sagittal axis is associated with each other. Okay, now what is it used for? Okay, we define the movement, and the movement is abduction. So the movement taking place in the frontal plane is the abduction. Okay, so taking the hands from the sides of the body up towards your head is called as abduction, and it takes place in the frontal plane and around the sagittal axis. Okay, now let us move on to the sagittal axis. I'm sorry, sagittal plane and frontal axis. In case of the sagittal plane, the associated axis is the frontal axis. Okay, the frontal axis again lies perpendicular to the sagittal plane, and the movement that is taking place in this is flexion of shoulder joint and the extension of the shoulder joint. So in this case, what happens is that the body, that is the hand, moves from the front of the body up. Okay, and then again back to its position or even behind in one single plane, that is the sagittal plane. So the movement that takes place in the sagittal plane includes flexion and extension. Okay, now let me clear that the axis for this joints, axis for these movements always passes through the joint. Okay, so now since we are talking about the shoulder joint, the axis will be passing straight from here. Okay, so this axis is placed over here, and with respect to, so it is important to understand that the axis in case of the shoulder joint is passing exactly through the joint. Okay, so it is not that the axis is lining here, it is at this position passing through this particular shoulder joint that we are talking about right now. Okay, and the axis is the reason is the this axis is around which the movement is taking place. Okay, in a circular manner. Hence, we need to remember that the axis is always in accordance with the joint that we are talking about. So if we are talking about the elbow joint, the axis will be here. If we are talking about the neck joint, the axis will be here. Okay, And hence now in case of the sagittal plane, the action is called flexion and extension. Okay, and there is one exception to all this, is the thumb joint. Okay, thumb is an exception to this, but for all the other joints in the human body, the flexion and extension takes place in the sagittal plane around the frontal axis. Now let us move on to the transverse plane and longitudinal axis. So now talking about the transverse plane, the axis associated is the longitudinal axis, okay? The longitudinal axis. Now, the movement that is taking place around this axis is all about the rotations of the human body. Okay, and since we're talking about the shoulder joint, let us consider the shoulder joint itself. So for this lies through the shoulder joint and perpendicular to the transverse plane. And the movement that takes place is called the rotation of the shoulder joint. So this is the medial rotation of the shoulder joint, that is towards the medial part of the body, and this is the external rotation of the shoulder joint, that is outside the body. So the movement is taking place at the shoulder joint, okay, and we can see it using the forearm. So the movement takes place from here till here in the arc. So this is the rotation of the joint. So all the rotation of the human body takes place around the longitudinal axis and in the transverse plane. As I said that the thumb is an exception to the other joints. Now why? Now when we talk about all the other joints, the movements are defined according to the three planes, that is the sagittal, frontal and transverse plane. Now for all the other joints, the flexion and extension takes place in the sagittal plane. Okay, flexion and extension in the sagittal plane. Wait, flexion and extension takes place in the sagittal plane, and abduction and adduction takes place in the frontal plane. Okay, for all the other joints I'm talking about, not the thumb joint. For the other joints, this takes place in the flexion and extension takes place in the sagittal plane, and the abduction adduction takes place in the frontal plane. But when we talk about the thumb, it is exactly opposite. Okay, flexion and extension takes place in the frontal plane. Okay, so flexion, F for flexion and F for frontal plane. In case of thumb, please remember, in case of thumb, flexion takes place in frontal plane, abduction adduction takes place in the sagittal plane. Now why is that so? Let us talk about. Now when we talk about, okay, for all the other joints also, we are defining the movement with respect to the anatomical position. Okay, so flexion and extension for other joints takes place to the sagittal axis, considering the body part is in the anatomical position. Now, in anatomical position, the thumb is not aligned with the other fingers. Okay, it is aligned 40 degrees away from the body. Okay, uh, or we can say from the fingers, 40 degrees away from the fingers, as a result of which the movements of the thumb are directed different from the other fingers. Okay, now the movement in the fingers as well as in other joints like hip, shoulder, knee, the movements are similar. Not, we cannot say similar, but the direction is similar. Okay, so for flexion it is in the sagittal plane, for abduction it is in frontal plane, for the other joints. But for this joint, it is exactly opposite. Flexion is in frontal plane and abduction is in sagittal plane. So the plane here is this way, the frontal plane. And for abduction, the plane is the sagittal plane. Now, talking about the opposition. Opposition is a slight variable action and it is not defined with the uh, frontal and the sagittal plane. Okay, the axis, the plane of for the opposition is inclined. Okay, it is in this way. So the action is taking your thumb towards the little finger point. Okay, so the plane for this movement is inclined. Okay, so we cannot call it as a frontal or sagittal plane, it is an inclined plane. Okay, So now I hope you have understood how thumb is an exception to the other joint, and how the movement takes place in the thumb. So please do not get confused. If you have any doubts regarding the planes and the axis, do put it in the comment box and I'll answer them all. Okay, and do not forget to like my page and subscribe to my channel, that is Physio Fortitude.